Coalition for Arizona that is co-sponsoring this with HSGP. And we're happy to welcome Bob McWhirter here to do the second in a series of 5 lectures about the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The next one is next week, same time, same place. So we hope to see you all then, and thank you all for coming out tonight. Bob.
Thank you. Abraham Lincoln lay dead at 7:21 a.m. on April 5th, 1865. Now, Abraham Lincoln in both life and death consecrated the Civil War. Just 1 year earlier, on April 8, 1864, Lincoln saw the Senate pass the 13th Amendment. He then saw, on January 31st, 1865, the House of Representatives passed the 13th Amendment. If you recall the Steven Spielberg's movie Lincoln, it was all about the passage in the House of Representatives and the battle that went there. Lincoln had used his considerable political skill to shepherd this amendment through Congress. He actually signed the 13th Amendment, making the 13th Amendment the only amendment in the Constitution with presidential signature. An amendment does not require a presidential signature. In fact, the executive branch actually has really nothing to do with it under the Constitution. But this showed Abraham Lincoln's commitment to ending slavery at last. Abraham Lincoln did not live to see the 13th Amendment become law, but it remains his greatest legislative achievement. No law before or since has so drastically changed America. This is the most important law ever passed, section of the original Constitution, I suppose, to come to America. Abraham Lincoln, through the turmoil of war and constitutional amendments, has shaped the Constitution more than any other president. But there's a toll on this man. This is Abraham Lincoln in 1861. This is Abraham Lincoln in 1863, probably the photograph we're most recognizable, familiar with. This is Abraham Lincoln in 1865. Now, there's a lot of theories that he had different medical conditions and whatnot. I personally think that this is the cost of it. His strength as a person, as a politician, was his ability to connect with people on a personal level. And riding through the battlefield and seeing the Union and Confederate dead and all these young boys essentially on the battlefield took its toll. Lincoln gave the last full measure of devotion that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom. Which is the 13th Amendment. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime thereof, the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Section 2, Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. Now, this is, of course, the natural outgrowth of the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist in the United States. Slavery at last had lost all legal foundation in America. Now, indeed, what I think is yet more radical for government structure is Section 2. Neither the Constitution nor the Bill of Rights gave the national government such power. Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. Totally reshuffled the deck of America. Congress shall have the power, not the states. Shall have the power to end slavery, create agencies, give present laws, attend to social rules. The 13th Amendment is aristocracy's reputation in America. Now, at the start of the Civil War, the aim was really not quite so clear. In his letter to Horace Greeley, if I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. If I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would do that also. Lincoln, though, in 1862 also said, in giving freedom to the slave, we assure freedom to the free. His thinking on this and the political realities evolves as the blood letting continues. By 1863, you've got an army recruitment broadside, not talking about union, but emancipation as the purpose of the war. To the point where late in 1863, we have the Gettysburg Address. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom. This is not talking about union. This is talking about something fundamentally American. At Gettysburg and scores of other places, Keating, Chancellorsville, Cold Harbor, Petersburg, Americans suffered and died for something greater than union. Freedom and self-government cannot suffer slavery. But this was a progression. We went basically from the framers to America becoming herself. Our Constitution has no eraser clause. The original sins are always there to see. They're still written right in the Constitution. You've got the 35th clause, the domestic administration clauses, fugitive slave clauses, importation clauses, all protecting the institutions of slavery. Charles Cotsworth Pinckney realized that, hey, this Constitution was a great deal for the slave power. The Constitution affords this property security and the right to recover it all over America. We're talking there specifically about the slave laws. The general government can never emancipate them, for no such authority is granted. In short, considering all circumstances, we have made the best terms for the security of this species of property it was in our power to make. We would have made better if we could, but on the whole, I would not think them bad. Good deal for the slave power. William Lloyd Garrison, in the 1850s, great emancipationist, great abolitionist, a great liberator, basically said, look, he called for the North to secede from the Union. The first calls for secession came from the North, not from the South. No union of slaveholders. The Constitution is a pro-slavery covenant with death and agreement with hell. And he was basically saying, look, we secede, slavery dies, because it's the mechanisms of the national federal government that's being used to maintain the institution. We leave this union, we leave this Constitution, slaves will just flee to the North, and there'll be no mechanism to send them back. A young Frederick Douglass in the 30s, when the Union be dissolved, I wish you could see it dissolved at once. Dissolve the Union, they, the slaves, will raise aloft their unfettered arms and demand freedom, let this holy, righteous Union be dissolved. Without the fugitive slave clause, the Upper South could not maintain slavery. The Southern aristocracy could not bear the huge cost of placing slavery on a national level. Now, we're going to see that Douglass actually comes to change his mind on these issues. Lincoln and others saw the seed, however, for something greater within the constitutional structure. First, the Constitution did not just create a national republic, it requires all the states to have a republican form of government. Now, this, at least on paper, repudiates any overtly aristocratic government in the southern states. In Federalist number 39, James Madison, slaveholder James Madison, is recognized. National and state governments were republican because their political institutions were established on the basis of human rights and framed for their preservation. Second, the word slave never appears in the original Constitution. Now, there's euphemisms used. You have other persons, such persons, or persons held to service or labor. The slaves are people. Even in the Constitution that recognizes and protects slavery. Well, the Confederate Constitution, in contrast, uses the term Negro slavery all over the place. The Confederate Constitution was just a copy of the American Constitution with a few little changes like referring to slaves. No bill and tainter, ex no snap the law, or law of denying and penning the right to the property of Negro slaves shall be passed. Abraham Lincoln made this very point in his Coffee Union speech, the speech that launched him in his national presidential campaign on February 27, 1860. Either the word slave or slavery is found in the Constitution, and whatever in that instance, the slave is called a person. This mode of alluding to slaves and slavery was employed on purpose to exclude from the Constitution the idea that there could be property in man. Abraham Lincoln knew of Gouverneur Morris. He's kind of like my favorite signer of the Declaration of Independence, all involved. He was the one who wrote out the Constitution. He also wrote that the preamble, we the people, that famous line, we the people. Upon what principle is it that the slaves should be computed in the representation? Are they men to make them citizens and let them vote? He was the most vocal abolitionist during the Constitutional Convention. And he writes this preamble, we the people. Now, if you go back to we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal in the Declaration, couple that with we the people, well, you really can't have this logical problem go on forever. Slaves are people. They're written as people in the Constitution. It is we the people. It's just as a matter of English grammar, you got a problem. The abolitionist society appealed to natural law and Christianity, and if you are a man, you are created equal. Salmon Chase and Abraham Lincoln had a belief in this fundamental structure of the Constitution. Later, Frederick Douglass was to go to that position. But look, this structure of the Constitution is something fundamentally that we can use. The Constitution of equally created people cannot perpetually suffer slavery's contradiction. The seed Morris and others planted allowed Lincoln to connect the Declaration of Independence to the Constitution with the Gettysburg Address. So you've got slavery in the basic creation of America. It was slavery that created the regions, more than geography, that created the regions of America. Slavery, rather than America, the North per se did not abolish slavery, but state by state abolition created the North. Likewise, the states keeping slavery became the South, even as far north as Missouri. This regional distinction was as much cultural as they were legal. New Jersey did not officially end slavery until 1865, but in 1860, the census recorded only 18 slaves. Now, this northern anti-slavery was not empty. There were efforts made. In the mid-1700s, New York slaves did at least 1/3 of all physical labor. 34% of Brooklyn residents were slaves, yet by the time of the Civil War, slavery was all but abolished. It passed a gradual abolition law in 1799 and slavery by 1827. So there was clear moral effort to end this in the North. Even today, the United States map shows slavery scarred. That big line across there, the 36-degree parallel, is the dividing line. They compromise for slave versus non-slavery. So Missouri sticks up there. Okay. You want to know about slavery in America? Just look at the map. It's right there. Now, Lincoln's second inaugural address in 1865, he recognized this. 1/8 of the whole population were colored slaves, but not distributed generally over the Union, but localized in the southern part of it. These slaves constituted a peculiar and powerful interest. All knew that this interest was somehow the cause of the war. To strengthen, perpetuate, and extend this interest was the object for which the insurgents were ready to use even by war, while the government claimed no right to do more than to restrict the territorial enlargement of it. Lincoln's always a good lawyer. So this gets to the issue about, what's this behind this Republican Party at this time, and their issue of slavery in the Republican Party. Look, slavery was always known as an economic oppressor. James Wilson, in a government whose maxims are those of oppression, there is no encouragement for industry. where tyranny reigns, agriculture, manufacturing, and commerce decline, and ignorance and vice proliferates. In such an aristocracy, for the common man, his country is his prison, its constitution is his curse, and its government is a rod of oppression that continually over his head. James Madison, slavery discourages arts and manufactures. The poor despise labor when performed by slaves. They prevent the migratory immigration of whites who generally enrich and strengthen the country. Slavery caused the depressed condition of Virginia. Remember, this man is a Virginian slaveholder. He's an aristocrat, but he's a Republican in my belief. During the 1850s, the United States enjoyed extraordinary economic growth, but not in the South. Slavery made it very few extremely wealthy, but it depressed the rest of the Southern economy. Ohio Senator Benjamin Wade, go to your patent office and see what products your degraded labor and refined aristocrat are. The matter never invents anything unless it's a new way of stuffing a chicken and mixing liquor.
Still true today.
The Republican Party understood slavery's destructive economics. America's future depended on free labor. And Republicans wanted the Western territories to have the North's prosperity unfettered by the liability of slavery. Abraham Lincoln, the Republicans wanted to revert succession and agreed with Garrison that slavery could not stand on its own. I have always hated slavery as much as any abolitionist. Slavery is a monstrous injustice and a cancer threatening the nation's lifeblood. That is Stevens. Like a scorpion surrounded by fire, slavery would sting itself to death until one slave at a time, encircling its labor with a cordon of freedom so that it cannot spread in less than 25 years. Every slaveholder state in the Union will have on its statute books a law for the gradual and final extinction of slavery. The South recognized this as well, which is why they could not suffer against Abraham Lincoln's position, which is, I'm not going to abolish slavery, I'm just not going to let it grow. Joining the secessionists, Senator Robert Tones, we must expand or perish. The slave power wanted more than just to protect slavery through states' rights. They wanted to expand the aristocracy and have the federal government continue enforcing its contradiction, which was in contradiction to states' rights. Recall I talked about that this time too. What happened to cause this dynamic? One of the people, the framers, thought that, hey, this is going to die out on its own because of its economic inefficiency. Well, technology kind of screwed things up. The cotton gin was invented. What the cotton gin did was destroy all hope that slavery would die out on its own. Although the gin decreased the labor it took to extract seeds from the cotton, it made cotton economically viable on a large scale. And this led to the plantation system requiring vast numbers of slaves. So a labor-saving device created a great need for labor. And that's where you get this institution. On the issue of slavery as an economic depressant, Frederick Douglass, in his autobiography, noted something. On a wharf in New Bedford, he originally went to New Bedford right after he had escaped. He was sitting there watching. I saw industry without bustle, labor without noise, toil honest, earnest, and exhausted without the will. In a seven port, 20 or 30 hands would be employed to do what 5 or 6 men, with the help of one ox, would do on a wharf in New Bedford. With a capital of about $60 in the shape of a good-natured old ox, attached to the end of a stout rope, New Bedford, with the work of $10,000 or $12,000, represented the bones and muscles of slaves and did it far better. This is an on-the-ground example of why slavery was so destructive. Talk a little bit about Black Lives Matter and self-determination in the Constitution. I've talked about the incomplete narrative, bad white people caused slavery, and good white people ended slavery. Well, okay, there's huge numbers of good white people that ended slavery. But Black self-determination was always a key factor because Black people vigorously took matters into their own hands. Whenever they had a chance, and even when African Americans struggled against bondage, just as Americans had done since the Revolutionary War. If you look at every clause in the Constitution that was pro-slavery, it was there because of Black self-determination. The very existence of these constitutional clauses belies any argument that Black people were suited to slavery or racial inferiority. Slave owners were always insecure because of Black self-determination. The 3/5 clause was challenged because Black people learned to read and raise legal challenges. The insurrection clause happened because Black people rebelled. Fugitive slave clause existed because Black people escaped. And the importation clause happened because of self-emancipation. All tied in to Black people doing what any of us would do. The 3/5 clause was notorious. Of our first presidents, only John Adams and John Quincy Adams, who only had one term each, were the only Northern presidents. The 3/5 clause was a disproportionate representation in the House of Representatives and thus a disproportionate representation in the Electoral College, which gave us Southern slaveholding presidents. This, by the way, also led to more pro-slavery judges being put on federal courts. So by 1842, more than 65% of the Supreme Court justices, 19 to 29, were Southerners. Now, contemporary voices, our friend Gouverneur Morris again. The inhabitants of Georgia or South Carolina who goes to the coast of Africa in defiance of the most sacred laws of humanity, tears away his fellow creatures from their dearest connections, and damns them to the most cruel bondages. So I have more votes in a government instituted for the protection of the rights of mankind than a citizen of Pennsylvania who views with a lot of horror so nefarious a practice. Kind of cuts against those arguments like, oh, these guys are just men of their time. You know, there's plenty of men of their time calling this out. Every African American who learned to read was rebelling. The 3/5 clause slaves were 3/5 of a person with becoming representation in Congress. Thus, even for the slavers, a slave still had to be a man, though it's the 3/5 of one. Behold, these cells will be self-evident, but all men are free people. Reading made the difference for Frederick Douglass. It opened his mind to the possibility of a greater world without bondage. His Aud, the kindly wife of Douglas's owner, taught him how to read. Mr. Aud disapproved sternly, lecturing Douglas, a slave, and of course, he didn't use the word slave. Douglas was all right, but he doesn't use the slave, but he'll just use slave in brackets. Should know nothing but to obey his master, to do as he was told to do. Learning would spoil the best slave in the world. Now, if you teach that slave, speaking of myself, how to read, there will be no keeping him. It will forever unfit him to be a slave. He would at once become unmanageable and of no value to his master. As to himself, it could do him no good, but a great deal of harm. It would make him discontented and unhappy. Slavery, it just, you know, learning how to read just really sucks.
That's why we ban books.
Books. His narrative was the Civil War's most famous slave narrative, selling over 30,000 copies within 5 years and remains widely read today. Once you learn to read and write, you will forever be free. A slaver can read and raise legal challenges, despite Justice Kingsley's statement in the Dred Scott case that Black people had no rights the courts were supposed to accept. The case itself shows an entire process Mr. Scott was able to use in a suit for freedom that existed and was able to be raised by people who could. Jefferson, as a lawyer, took cases of Black people arguing for freedom, and as a master, took out ads to catch his own runaways. Go figure.
Yeah, really.
The Amistad case, remember the movie Steven Spielberg? Complicated legal process showed that this process existed. Slave trade and natural law freedom collided in Amistad. Africans rebelled, schooner Amistad in 1839. By 1841, the court, through Justice Joseph Story, said the Africans were illegally transported as slaves and rebelled in self-defense. They'd already been freed in 35, they returned to Africa in 1842. Now, the Dred Scott began in 1836 when two things happened. Roger Taney became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and U.S. Army Surgeon John Emerson took a slave Dred to the free state of Illinois on 42. 20 years later, Dred Scott began his plea for freedom, arguing taking into a free state made him free. Thus, the Constitution's freedom of slave clause, the 15th Act, could not compel any state to send him back to bondage. Now, the precedent of this was an English case called Somerset versus Stewart in 1772, where it found once a slave hit the free soil of England, he became forever free. And slavery could only be maintained by positive law. It was not natural slavery, and the statutes created it. It was a big cause and the reason why the South joined the American Revolution. They hated this opinion. But this is what Dred Scott was using as precedent. He lost his case in the Supreme Court, but the case showed an entire process that existed that Black people would avail themselves of to argue for freedom. And they took advantage of this law to gain freedom. Solomon Northup won freedom from a legal process. Remember the end of the movie, 12 Years a Slave, it's narrative. He's released after the 12 years because of a legal process that the South was bound to respect. And why do these challenges work? It was pure legalism. If you have your institution based on legal written laws, it's not a natural law, so it's not natural. You have it based on the Fugitive Slave Act and the technicalities that can keep it back in the bondage, and you have to respect when somebody like Mr. Northup or the Amistad plaintiffs actually win their suits for freedom. And begrudgingly, the South had their freedom back. These suits work because the denial is denied the legal foundation of slavery itself. Now, slavers diligently worked to protect their interests through law, as the Constitution pro-slavery clause exemplified. Their diligent action as slavery was not natural, but only implemented through legislation. In this environment, Black people against the cause was the same agility and intelligence as any other group. The three-fifths clause. In a segregated slaveholding society, counting ancestry becomes imperative. A mulatto, one person with one Black and one white parent, etc. With all these different racial classifications, quadroon, octoroon, quintoon, hexadeciroon, ST. People become obsessed with these deviations. Quadroon comes from Spanish, literally the fourth, octoroon, eighth, hexadeciroon is groove. One of the points I make is men of education define as either Greek and Latin derivatives and phrases. The normal Southern guy on the street wasn't speaking Greek, it was the aristocratic South. Slaveholders were. Underscoring that slavery was not in the interest of most Southerners. Just as, frankly, racism today is not in the interest of poor white people, although poor white people are the most perpetuated. And that's served people of great economic means continually. And of course, you end up to simplify this with the one drop. One drop makes you a slave. Leads to Homer Pleasant. Homer Pleasant could have passed the Passat law in Louisiana. He was in Octoroon, Louisiana, couldn't sit in a white rail car, although anybody told. I wouldn't have been able to tell the difference. The Supreme Court decided Ferguson basically created the doctrine of separate but equal. John Marshall Harlan said, in view of the Constitution and the eye of the law, there is in this country no superior dominant ruling class of citizens. There is no caste here. Our Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes of citizens. In respect of civil rights, all citizens are equal before the law. He was a lone dissenter in Plessy versus Ferguson. And of course, he becomes the clarion for the civil rights justices and frankly the Warren Court. Walter Francis White was actually a black man. Again, probably a guy who could have passed, but he fought the fight in the end of the CP. He oversaw plans to organizational structure of the fight against public segregation. He authored President Truman's desegregation of the troops in 1947. And what happens is they created the law and the precedent to show that separate could never be equal. And they did it in a systematic step-by-step approach. Thurgood Marshall, of course, is the one that's an arguing opinion. He comes on the Supreme Court, gets his own postage stamp, and it calls back to John Marshall Harlan, who his grandson, John Marshall Harlan III, is sitting on the Supreme Court at the time. Rebellion. African-American rebellion permeated the South. One estimate is between 1619 and 1865, there were over 250 slave rebellions. You don't hear much about that in American history. I guess that would be correct, at least the slavers were so fearful that they put in constitutional guarantees of federal government intervention to suppress slave revolts, ignoring their own arguments that slavery was purely states' rights. Domestic insurrection clauses, Article 4, Article 1, which is protect against this. What is the proposed compensation to the United States for a sacrifice of every principle of right of every impulse of humanity? They are to bind themselves to march the North for the defense of the Southern states against those very slaves with whom they complain. Again, our friend David Morris. Responding to a Southern delegate's argument, our slaves being our property, why should we be taxed more than land, sheep, cattle, horses? Benjamin Franklin, of course, clears back. There is some difference between them and sheep. Sheep will never make any insurrection. You want the guy with always the best sound bites and clips, it's going to be Benjamin. Gabriel Rebellion, 1800. Denmark Passage Rebellion, 1822. Trial day of execution, 5 leaders. Only 1 leader confessed, all others remained silent. Basically, they were snitched off by 2 other slaves who got life pensions and freedom. Nat Turner's Rebellion is probably the most famous. About 70 black people, freedom of 70 black people, about 60 white people were killed. Officials tried 48 black men and women and executed 56. Black people were tried. A lot more were killed. People were, slaves who removed their slave owners were executed property. The militia and white mobs killed nearly 120 other black people. And by the way, these are the most famous. Well, no. The reason why we know about it, Nat Turner's rebellion is lawyer Thomas Ruffin Gray wrote a little memoir about it, The Confessions of Nat Turner, which later then becomes William Styron's Pulitzer Prize novel, The Confessions of Nat Turner in 1967. The Birth of a Nation in 2016 was about the Turner Rebellion, which, by the way, was a slap at W.B. Griffith's 1950 racist ran Birth of a Nation. Birth of a Nation and W. Griffith still uses kind of Klan recruiting bill. Black men, so that's why other movies make the same thing. White religious leaders tried to cultivate black ministers to help them detect slave misconduct. They never bargained for somebody like Nat Turner who had this religious fervor about it. He thought God was talking to him directly to lead the rebellion. And frankly, Christianity is a liberating message, which leads you to, of course, Dr. Martin Luther King, I Have a Dream speech, 1963, and the Civil Rights Movement and its religious foundation. Legislatures such as Georgia and South Carolina have mechanisms to reward people who snitched. Douglas said the slave owners have been known to send spies among their slaves to ascertain their views and feelings in regard to their condition. But most slaves refuse to inform, and frequently of this has had the effect to establish among slaves the maxim that a still tongue makes a wise head. Slaves suppress the truth rather than take the consequences of telling it, and so doing prove themselves part of the truth. There was at least one significant rebellion, John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, that involved white people. And it was the great precursor to the Civil War, tragic prelude. Interesting thing about the Harper's Raid was it was put down by a certain Colonel Robert Lee commanding Marines. And they put it down, and of course, this becomes under the domestic insurrection clause, the exercise of that. And of course, Robert E. Lee becomes one of the main protagonists of the Southern cause during the Civil War. Escape. Now, these are paintings drawn in the 1860s, starting to show more of a consciousness in the North about what's going on. What may have limited slave rebellions actually was the availability of escape, which would siphon off a lot of slaves that would normally be rebellious, but they won't be able to escape instead. Constitution through the slave cause, acts, prevalence of African American fight for bondage. Estimates are several hundred slaves escaped north every year. This skimmed off the slaves most likely to die. The Underground Railroad, the black and white activists facilitated escapes. It's a network of secret routes leading African Americans to Canada. Estimates by 1850, 100,000 slaves escaped via the railroad. Of course, Harriet Tubman was the most famous conductor of the railroad. She went back 13 times and helped over 200 slaves. And you want to hold up an example for your daughters. Harriet Tubman. That's a woman with guts. And of course, this mural by Michael Rosato is on the cover of my book, and gave permission for us to use it. And I'm grateful for it. Love her. I was a conductor of the Underground Railroad for 8 years, and I can say what most conductors can't say. I never ran my train off the track, and I never lost a passenger. Now, Northern resentment of the injustice of the 1850 slave law was a key factor leading to the Civil War, even much more than the 3 Fifths Clause. And of course, what the Emancipation Proclamation symbolized was what Northern was said, because it was a direct kind of refutation, at least as a public statement, of all of the slaves. With the war, thousands of slaves fled to Union lines for self-emancipation. Now, the proclamation did not free the slaves until the 13th Amendment to do that, but again, it was recognizing and supporting Black self-determination. So this leads us to the road to the 13th Amendment. The South could have chosen another route than war. Before the Civil War, the Constitution was unclear whether a state could leave the Union. Now, I think there are better arguments that you can't, given what Madison said in the Federalist Papers, but they could have had a good argument of that. And don't forget, they're going to the Canadian Supreme Court. They could have brought a case. Now, Dred Scott already ruled on the Constitution of the Republican platform of preventing slavery's expansion. They could have brought that case to the Supreme Court. Now, even if Lincoln, they would have won, if Lincoln wouldn't have accepted the ruling, they would have been on a better legal foundation and political foundation. Saying, look, we have a right to succeed. This is just wrong. They can politically outmaneuver them on that. But what happened was the fire agents in the South wanted war instead, which is why they started the Civil War. 1861 cartoon shows the succession of Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana donkey style in South Carolina, right off. Fire agents controlled state legislatures and invented. They manipulated state secession conventions, avoiding the popular votes against leaving the Union. Southerners in the South did not vote to succeed in the Union. It was the aristocratic control of state legislatures that voted to do so. This was against the will of those Southerners who probably opposed separation from the Union. Now, there was an original 13th Amendment passed just before the Civil War. It was called the Corwin Amendment. And what it said was, basically, Thomas Corwin passed it. House of Representatives and Senate approved it, that basically it abolished or interfered with domestic institutions of any state, including state. In other words, the federal government could not mess around with state institutions. And this was the thought of a way to appease that and say, look, we're going to protect slavery. Had another effect too, which would have also protected northern personal liberty laws. that it would make it sort of northern states in that sense they back. So it kind of was a double-edged sword there. Now, of course, this was mooted by the Civil War, this proposed 13th Amendment. And of course, by April 61, they were talking about it more. So by 1863, the Republic of the North would win the war, the military emancipation or state abolition to destroy slavery. So this is where you start getting draft amendments circulated for what becomes the 13th Amendment. Although inconceivable in 1860, the war made the 13th Amendment's ratification possible in 1865. The newly proposed 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, it sails through the Senate, as we discussed. Only a few border state senators argued either black people's inferiority or the men who violate property rights in the post-war reconstruction or whatnot. Passed it. We talked about the House was more difficult, traders, Japanese warmongers, slave mongers, Negro worshippers, whatever. Goes to the South, but every Republican voted in favor of the 16 Democratic votes, all but 2 were lame ducks. This is part of the cajoling that went on to get this passed. 5 border states, including West Virginia, produced 19 votes for the amendment and only 8 against. Probably reason why West Virginia separated the rest of Virginia. The reason for the vitriol was this was slavery's last stand. President Clinton's full support behind the amendment, Clinton called a special session of Congress in March, and the amendment failed. The amendment is a keen cure for all evils. Now, the 13th Amendment goes to the states. 3/4 of the states are needed to ratify the amendment. By 1865, that meant 27 states. 5 former Confederate states had ratified. By 1860, the United States stopped admitting slave states. By the end of 1865, 7 former slave states, Maryland, Missouri, Tennessee, Arkansas, Louisiana, Virginia, West Virginia, abolished slavery. Amending the national constitution is now conceivable. Now, that's what happens. An interesting little fact is that even today, the original Confederate states could block an amendment to the Constitution ending slavery. With 50 states, it takes 38 states to amend the Constitution, as proponents of the Equal Rights Amendment have found. 12 states can block an original amendment. There was really 15 slave states that could still block that. Again, this is a tribute, not only to Abraham Lincoln, but the Republican Party's mechanism to get this through the southern states. 8 months after Lincoln's murder, 1865, December 6th, the required number of states passed the 13th Amendment. Secretary of State William Stewart proclaimed its adoption on December 18th, 1865. The national government did not encroach on state sovereignty to impose emancipation nationally. It worked through the state legislatures, which, by the way, now include black people voting, to get them through enfranchising not only black people, but poor whites who had never been enfranchised before. The 13th Amendment ratification was a triumph of state government, as Article 5 of the Constitution provides. Now, South Carolina remained as backward and racist as when it started the war 5 years earlier. When it ratified in November, it arrogated its own interpretive declaration that any attempt by Congress towards legislating upon the political status of former slaves or their civil relations would be contrary to the Constitution of the United States. That little part about Congress shall have the power to impose this by public legislation. Yeah, okay. Delaware rejected it until 1901. Kentucky rejected it until 1976. And Mississippi rejected it until 1995. I think it's pretty embarrassing. Poor Delaware, Kentucky, Mississippi. This is a view from the old Mistress Winslow Homer, kind of this meeting between freed slaves and the former owner. But it must have been a lot of uncomfortable little meetings right after this thing passes, right? America changed forever. The fundamental and astounding result is that we now live in America that expects and indeed almost takes for granted the new birth of freedom. Now, the 13th Amendment's original intent is pretty clear. Because there was legislation passed. It was more than just to liberate slaves. It was to codify the natural right of property each person has in oneself, to exchange his labor for wages. John Locke had written, every man has property in his own person. The framers desired to strip America of the vestiges of aristocratic caste. Now, a lot of this has been lost. Quite frankly, there was precious little litigation and case law under the 13th Amendment. 13th Amendment's second clause empowers Congress, again, the radical restructure of the balance between state and federal government. And national action is necessary when states threaten fundamental rights. Republican James Garfield insisted, later President James Garfield, we must see to it, and hereafter personal liberty and personal rights are placed in the keeping of the nation. That the right to life, liberty, and property shall be guaranteed to the citizen in reality as they are now in the words of the Constitution, and no longer left to the caprice of mobs or contingencies of local legislation.
Yeah, what about Dobbs? Let's apply that to Dobbs, should we?
Oh, I'm sorry, did you say something?
Yeah, I did.
Well, look, what's asserting is this was very clear what they intended. The Supreme Court has not followed the original intent of this amendment. And it's usually the very proclaimed originalists on the court that aren't following the original intent. This was known by them at the time as the Second American Revolution. They talked about it in terms of the Second American Revolution. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 put the intent in practice. Certain states passed black codes, undermined the new Constitution, recodifying the pre-war slave codes. The Jim Crow South's foundation were these black codes. To allow the plantation aristocracy to reestablish dominance for not just black people, but poor whites. Racial segregation becomes the South's new social order. Congress passed the Civil Rights Act under the 13th Amendment this is, by the way, the origin of our term civil rights comes from this statute. All persons are citizens of the United States, and all citizens of every race, color shall have the same right as enjoyed by white citizens. President Andrew Johnson, who is probably the only person happy that Donald Trump became president, because he was viewed widely as the worst president ever in his time. Basically was an obstacle. He hated slave power, but he was a racist. He vetoed the Civil Rights Act, arguing that conferred citizenship on freedmen when 11 of the 36 states remain unrepresented in Congress. Well, so what? They were in rebellion. Discriminated against whites, was his argument. And the 13th Amendment made the act unnecessary. Well, amendments need, legislation to implement. So despite over 200 years of institutional slavery and domestic terrorism against black people, Johnson vetoed it. But the Civil Rights Act said nothing of the sort, just all should have the same right as enjoyed by white citizens, not more rights, the same rights. Congress overrode the veto, which was the first time that ever happened in American history. The first presidential veto overruled. No doubt as to the framers' expansive view of the 13th Amendment, which quite frankly, we still have yet to debate. Now, how does the 13th Amendment help America become? Abraham Lincoln again was dead in the morning of April 15th, 1865. Walt Whitman in his Leaves of Grass wrote, "Oh, Captain, my Captain, our fearful trip is done. The ship has weathered every raft, the prize we sought is won. The port is near, the bells I hear, the people all exulting, while follow eyes and steady keel, the vessel gleaming there. But oh, heart, oh, bleeding drops of lead, around the deck my captain lies, falling over the deck." He'd written that about Abraham. See, Lincoln and thousands of others, black and white, fought and died for an ever-expanding view of America. So the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. So, 13th Amendment.
Questions? I've been writing them down. So anybody got questions out there?
I know. Quick, somebody else, please. Otherwise, I have to listen to
Wait, somebody
Diane.
else. All right then.
Go, Diane.
I read that the 4/5 clause was actually a positive thing because the Southerners wanted it not to be mentioned so they could count the slaves in their population and thus have an even more representation in Congress and the Electoral College. If the Northerners wanted them not to be counted at all, which would give the North more power because they had a higher population.
Yep.
And so it's right.
It was actually the North that got the 3/5 clause.
Yeah.
Because of that very reason. Now, yeah, I mean, the slavers wanted to count every slave as a person without giving any civil rights.
Right.
Rights. Great deal for them. And the compromise the North agreed to is, okay, we'll agree to this. So it was actually the North that did it.
Right.
They were not willing to really take on the real issue is, why not just count them, like Gouverneur Morris said, count them as a person and give them voting rights and everything else. Which, by the way, need I mention in my book is called Fixing the Framers' Failure.
And it's going to be here.
It's going to be here probably next week until any day it's on its way.
Okay.
Okay. Next.
My next question is about, I just read about the Southern Railroad, which I didn't know existed.
Yeah, I do not know much about it. I have known of its existence heading people south through Mexico and the Caribbean.
Yeah.
Yeah, it did exist. But
Well,
I don't know.
what
It's
I read
just,
about it was that it went through Texas and into Mexico because Mexico did not allow slavery.
Right.
And so Arizona too, sometimes they came through Texas into Arizona and they went into Mexico from there, which didn't allow slavery. And that they estimate, while whatever number it was that escaped north, it was a minuscule number, like 3,000 to 5,000 actually escaped through the southern route.
Yeah. By the way, very interesting what happens in the South. You do know that there's a town in Brazil that celebrates the Confederacy.
Yeah.
A lot of
Yeah.
Confederates went to and started a little colony down in Brazil
Yeah.
where slavery was still legal. And they
Yeah.
still have this celebration with Confederate flags and all this kind of stuff.
Yes, I heard about that.
Yeah.
Funny thing about South America, attracting the most wonderful people.
That's kind of funny when you hear about states' rights with the Portuguese accent. Right?
Well, there's Confederates and Nazis went there.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
yeah. All right, my last question is, and this is a debate that I've been involved in, is the 13th Amendment says slavery and involuntary servitude, comma, except in cases where they're convicted of a crime, etc. Some people are arguing that the comma, except in cases when you're convicted, applies only to involuntary servitude and does not apply to slavery, that slavery can never exist, even if you've been convicted, although involuntary servitude does. Do you know about this argument, and do you have an opinion on it?
Is the distinction with any meaning in the end when you're talking about mass incarceration?
Yes, it is.
Well,
Yeah.
part of it, I just didn't do this for question time, is that whole question of that clause in the 13th Amendment, which, by the way, for the first time slavery appears in the Constitution, is the 13th Amendment. First time the word
Yep, yep.
appears. And by the way, look, I don't know the nuances of that debate. The language is often sometimes touted, and I think incorrectly, that, oh, they stuck this in just as a sabotage of the entire thing, which the South did use, of course, petty crime and the enslavement of people.
Right.
And I deal with that in the chapter. Fair enough. I don't think that's fair at all. What happened was they got the language from the Northwest Ordinance. And it was simply put in there as a logical thing. Well, if they commit a crime, they lose their civil rights. And so it was put in there with, I think, not much thought and not much realization as how the South could exploit the loophole to bring in, as part of mechanisms, including tolling taxes, et cetera, to bring in slavery, all that. So,
How it impacts still today is the lawsuit against the for-profit prisons,
yeah,
arguing that slavery is what they're doing, which is prohibited by the 13th, whereas they're saying, oh no, we're doing involuntary servitude when you're punished, and that's okay. So that's where that argument is now being utilized in actual cases still today. Question back there.
By the way, I think part of that involves servitude in the Northwest ordinance had to do with indentured servants.
Yeah, and there were a lot of
Right.
Irish indentured
Right.
servants.
So,
You mentioned, or the way you phrased your comment was that it shows that there are still a lot of people who are against slavery even at that time. Is that a comment based on the latest theories of presentism?
yeah, don't get me started on presentism. No, all I'm saying is there were voices. Gouverneur Morris is one, Benjamin West was another, even Benjamin Franklin was another, Alexander Hamilton. They were anti-slavery. They were clearly anti-slavery. Look, they all made a deal of Faustian bargain with the southern states to keep them in. Arguably, in retrospect, did they do the right thing? Well, we have the country we have today, and the greatness of America. Okay. They also sincerely believed or deluded themselves in believing that slavery would die under its own kind of impracticality. Of course, as I talked about, the cotton gin kind of screwed up the calculus up. So they thought the slavery would die, or they deluded themselves in that, and decided to make the deal work for the nation as a whole. Would it have been better had it not? That's one of those what ifs. So.
Not experimental science.
And, John Adams was anti-slavery, said, look, I'll leave it to your judgments on the issue of slavery, and I won't go in and do anything against it to get them to stay into it.
Any other questions? Well, thank you again, Bob, for a wonderful evening. Hey.
You don't